Again, we'll be having we have some people still joining in, so we'll begin in a couple minutes. Thank you all for joining us today. We're here to discuss the Maui wildfires, as well as kind of the government failure and the weaponization of natural disasters. I'll be hosting today's call, and at the end, we'll have some time for questions. But first, I'll kick it over to Steve Milloy to introduce everyone, and then they will all give a couple minutes presenting on the different topics, and then we'll go to questions. Steve?
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in this morning. We're going to be talking about the Maui wildfires. Leading off today's discussion will be Greg Wrightstone, Executive Director of the CO2 Coalition. Greg will talk about the climate angle that has been used with the wildfires. I will be next. I'm with the E&E Legal Institute. I will be talking about how government dropped the ball with the wildfires. And then we will be followed by Dr. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute. He is the director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate and Environmental Policy. And Sterling will be talking about how the weather has been weaponized this year to advance the climate agenda. So with that, I will turn it over to Greg.
Thank you, Steve. The tragic fires at Lahaina, just like fires all around the world globally, require three primary elements for a wildfire. That's a fuel load, its aridity, and an ignition source. Those three elements can be exacerbated, as they were at Lahaina, by high winds. We'll start with the fuel load first. The area around Lahaina over the last century or so has been dominated by agriculture. The areas and the fields that are now covered with grasses were fields where they're growing pineapples and sugar cane. The closing of the processing plants meant that agriculture of those crops were abandoned, and they've now been reclaimed by invasive grasses. If you'd looked at the area around Lahaina like I did before the fire, you'd see the entire area is just covered with brown grass. And it's these grasses that provide the fuel load. The aridity was caused by a seasonal drought that occurs every year on Maui between May 15th and the end of July. The wet season is earlier, and in fact, it wasn't, you may not know, but this year was wetter and colder, cooler than normal. So what we had there was the wetter weather accelerated the grass growth and increased the fuel load of the grasses. And the ignition source was caused by electricity. 98% of all ignitions in Hawaii are human caused by accidents, down power lines and such. And in this case, we had the strong, what are called lehua winds that come across the mountain. They rush down the western slope of the mountain, and they're funneled into the town of Lahaina, very similar to the Santa Ana winds or the Diablo winds of California. And these winds came down 60, 80 miles an hour, knocked down power lines, sparking fires and setting them off. So all these things combined, of course, the high winds from these lehua winds accelerated the fire into the town of Lahaina. You may also not know, in 1858, when Lahaina was a very much smaller town, the center of the city was destroyed by a very similar event. So these lehua winds, they occur 2, maybe 3 times a year. And once every 10 or 12 years, they get very bad, like we did this year. So these are all natural events, and none of these events are related to climate change. They would have occurred with high CO2 levels or low CO2 levels. They would have occurred with high temperatures or low temperatures. So again, it was not related to climate change. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about how the government really dropped the ball here. And I think it's important to realize, and I really haven't seen this written about very much in the media, the government's number one job is public safety. That's why we pay all our money in taxes, for the government to protect us from domestic and international threats, and that includes wildfires. The government of Hawaii and Maui, the county government there, have completely failed. They knew that wildfires were a possibility. As a matter of fact, they've had in recent memory wildfires going back decades. Greg mentioned that as the plantations left, these non-native grasses took over, and these grasses, with under green policies, are just overgrown. They dry out. They become even more susceptible to wildfires than what was there before. The government knew that these grasses could dry out and cause wildfires, and this has happened in the recent past. In 2018, we had the same fact pattern as we just saw 2 weeks ago. It was August. The winds came down off the mountains. The grasses were dry. There was a spark, and there was a fire, and no one was prepared to do anything. It was a disaster. Fortunately, firefighters were able to contain it, but they were not able to contain it this year. It was just a massive fire with the wind. Imagine being in front of a flamethrower. The government was not prepared. The government had not warned anyone that this was going to happen. The government of Hawaii has a disaster plan. They tell people what to do in case of floods, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes. They list wildfires as a hazard, but there's no instruction on what to do. Lahaina has sirens, for tsunamis. The government didn't want to turn them on because they thought people would be confused and would actually run into the fire. I mean, that's ridiculous. As the fire started to spread, the firefighters got there, but there was no water in the hydrants. The Maui official who recently lost his job because of this, he delayed for 5 hours. And of course, the fire department was not prepared to take water from the ocean, which is, an unlimited supply of water to use, but they weren't prepared to do that. The whole thing is just, Lahaina is designed to be a death trap. There's really one road in and out. There's absolutely no government preparation for this. And this is government's job. The guy who is in charge of Maui emergency preparedness, he quit. He's unapologetically. He didn't want to turn the sirens on. He would not turn them on again, I guess. It's really very twisted. Since the disaster, the government has largely been absent. We've heard Maui residents complaining about the absence of government, the absence of aid. The military was 30 minutes away from Maui, but as of a few days ago, there was no one there. So this whole thing has really been a tragedy caused by the government. The government did not warn anyone, had no plans what to do in case of fire, just basically had no plans. And instead, you see the government is blaming climate. And, the state attorney general, at the request of the governor, is now conducting a review. So we're going to have, the government reviewing the government. And of course, that's not going to work out very well, I don't think, because they're just going to wind up blaming climate, which, as Greg just discussed, is nonsense. Well, I think what we need to do is there needs to be government accountability, starting with the governor, Dr. Josh Green. I think he should resign. There have been, yesterday in the New York Times, he admitted that he was not prepared for this. He said he was great with COVID because he was a doctor, but this is really sort of a new experience for him. And I'm sorry, there are more than 100 people dead. 850 still missing, many children, these people burned to death in their cars because he's worried about, he's prepared for COVID, but nothing else. But the job of governor is a lot more complicated than just COVID. There's a lot more to do. So, I think that he should resign, and there should be an investigation, but not done by the Hawaiian government, not even done by the federal government, because it's very politicized. I think it should be done by Congress. Kevin McCarthy should convene a special investigative committee to look at the situation, because government's number one job is to keep us safe, and instead, government is with our tax money. Take the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. They're taking all this money from us, supposedly for climate. They're building wind turbines and solar panels and EVs. Meanwhile, in Lahaina, no one spent a nickel getting anybody ready for a foreseeable disaster. And that is just unforgivable. And so we need to have accountability. So I'll stop there for now and turn it over to Sterling.
Yeah, not just a foreseeable disaster, but a foreseen disaster, since they've been warned for more than a decade that wildfires were a major risk, and they ignored it. Concerning the weaponization of the media, this has been going on for some time. The Los Angeles Times a decade ago said they would no longer run any letters to the editor or editorials disputing any aspect of climate change, even data filled. In the last year, the Associated Press accepted millions of dollars from 6 climate foundations that push the climate narrative to hire people to report daily on climate change. And in this past year, we've got Maui, and a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, within hours, the media was dancing on the still smoldering corpses of the people of Lahaina, blaming climate change, only to in the days after starting to back off and recognize that other factors, like the fact that government didn't clear invasive native grasses and replant fire-resistant native plants, started to blame them. But it's not just Lahaina and Maui; it's Hurricane Hillary. The initial things were, oh, climate change is making this worse. Climate change. When was the last time that they had a hurricane? Tropical cyclone of this size hit California? Well, 84 years ago, 84 years of climate change ago, when the earth was cooler. They looked at Florida earlier this year and said, oh, the oceans are boiling. Of course, the oceans weren't boiling, but it was in the headlines. And they got that from a single buoy, not on the oceanside coast of Florida, but in a bay, that sat less than 5 feet at high tide above the ocean floor. And at low tide, it nearly rests on the ocean floor, which absorbs heat. It's very few feet from the shore itself. So it's not representative of the ocean, but they took it, they hyped it as if it were representative of the ocean. They have done this for storm after storm, for wildfire after wildfire. They jumped on the wildfires in Greece and Spain and Canada, only to find out that many of these wildfires were actually human-caused fires from arson. In Canada, they ignore the fact that Canada's own studies show wildfires have been declining, and in fact crediting climate change for that decline because of the increased moisture in Canada. What they've got there is another government failure. Build up of timber, build up of fuel, as Gregory wrote, and no management of that fuel. So when a wildfire starts, you've got lots of kindling and no roads accessing the kindling to put it out before it gets to inhabited areas, no thinning of the forest. That's not climate change. That is poor management. And yet climate change is constantly blamed for everything. If the monsoons are bad one year in India, well, climate change is causing monsoons to worsen. If the monsoons are less powerful one year in India, well, climate change is causing the monsoons to weaken. If the Atlantic Ocean current is increasing, it's climate change. If it's decreasing, it's climate change. The point is the media jumps on any weather event, any shift in natural currents, and blames climate change for it, even if it is the opposite of what they claimed days, months, or years ago. That is not good journalism. They don't look at data. They don't look at facts. They've lost the ability to do investigative journalism. I was refreshed a bit to see how quickly they had to start backing off this Maui story and start pointing to other factors than climate change, even though every story still contains some climate stuff. But I think that was just because it was so in everybody's face and so terrible that maybe even the media was showing some shame. I don't know. But the weaponization of the media is one of the most egregious and dangerous things about the whole climate issue, because it's not doing its job and presenting the facts to its audience. Facts are data. Facts are the kinds of things that Gregory talked about, the kinds of things that Steve talked about. For most of these weather events, they're not talking about any of those factors. Instead, it's climate change, climate change, climate change, and it's all for an agenda to push the enlargement of government, the increasing role of government in people's lives, and restriction of fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you, Sterling. So let's go back to Drew.
Yes, thank you guys. And what we'll do now is open the floor up for questions. If you have a question, please say your name and outlet and raise your hand, and we'll call and click on you. I think Catherine has a question. Catherine, you're good to go.
Yeah, Catherine Salgado from PJ Media. And I find it interesting the mention of arson in other cases, because I have seen a few people online, including some people who were locals in Hawaii, saying that arson could have been at least a contributing factor to the fires, which then, of course, you have wind, government neglect, all these other factors playing into it. Do you see that as a credible possibility for what started or contributed to the fires? Or do you think that it's just, people freaking out about government neglect, about losing everything?
I'll take that. So, Catherine, I believe last May, the Maui government or the Hawaiian government was investigating the possibility of arson in some fires last year. I think you always have to have that in the back of your mind as a possible ignition source. I mean, you can have arson, you can have negligence, like not taking care of the grasslands, or you can have power lines, which I guess is another form of negligence. But arson is a possibility. I think they're going to have to actually conduct an investigation and see. I just point out last year, the Yellowstone fires they were set by a climate activist. This year, I believe it's the Yellowknife fires in Canada. There were 4 girls arrested with aerosol cans and lighters. So arson is a real possibility. But whether it's arson or a power line or a lightning strike, the government knew the conditions were ripe for a wildfire, for a disastrous one. Lahaina was just sitting duck for something that got out of control, and the ball was just dropped the whole time.
Can I just add? It's too early. We don't know what sparked this particular fire, or whether it was sparked in several locations. But what we do know is that earlier this year, the governor of Hawaii said he was spending $100 million additional dollars to fight climate change. Not one of those dollars went to clear brush and native grasses. Not one of those dollars went to make sure that fire hydrants were filled with water. to ensure that the sirens would be set off in an emergency. Any one of those single actions, which would have cost a fraction of that $100 million, would have done more to save lives than all the spending that he did, which saved no lives. The media is not reporting on that. Once again, the weaponization of the media.
Yeah, just to follow up with that, Hawaii Electric, the utility out there, gave the Hawaiian government a $190 million plan last June to prevent wildfires, and the government just sat on it. Meanwhile, everyone, including Hawaii Electric, spending all this money on windmills and solar panels and this and that, all this green stuff. No one is doing their basic job. Everyone has been distracted by climate, away from their fundamental duties.
And we could just add too, our fire experts here at the CO2 Coalition have proposed pretty simple and inexpensive ways to protect these towns and your homes, and that's to control the grasses and have fire breaks around these. There was another small town in the same event that was spared the fire wrath because they had contractors with bulldozers that actually went ahead and cleared the grasses and piled them up in huge piles. So when the fire did come, it stopped at the fire break. That's a really inexpensive way to do it. A small herd of goats eating. I mean, there are things that we could do that cost very little amount of money to control these grasses. And that's what they need to look at.
Just real fast to follow up on that. Do you think that the government isn't interested in doing any of these measures precisely because they either are lazy, or maybe they really just want to be able to blame disasters on climate change? Maybe they're part of that whole weaponization of the media that is trying to play up climate change.
I think one of this is, I think the government and they have blinders on, and the blinders are focused solely on climate change and curing a non-existent problem, rather than looking at the real possible dangers we have, like this fire.
Yeah, it goes back to, it's an old saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They are so focused on climate change that even when their own reports, their own official reports say wildfire is a high risk, they don't focus on wildfire, because to them, wildfires aren't wildfires, they're climate fires. If it weren't for climate change, they'd never have wildfires. These guys seem to, I think they truly believe, some of them.
So, Catherine, I think you're getting to a really the key and possibly darkest question of all. Why is this stuff not done? These are real dangers. We know just from the wildfires we've seen in the West, California, while wildfires have declined in burn acreage and frequency over the past 100 years, there is some uptick now. And, the reason is pretty obvious. It's because we've let forests, we don't log anymore. We don't take care of them. We don't even have roads to get into forests. And we've allowed them to become tinderboxes. And the fact that there's all this, underbrush, undergrowth allowed to grow, I mean, that just makes things worse when there is a drought, because all that other growth sucks up all the water. So the government has allowed these things to turn into tinderboxes, and now when it burns, they never admit fault. No one accepts blame for these faulty policies. Instead, they just scream climate, and the media plays along with it. And so you have to ask yourself the question: is this really kind of, what's up with this? Because everyone now knows around the world, there's these wildfires are being exacerbated by poor forest management, yet no one is doing anything about it. And you must ask why. In Maui, I mean, this is really egregious. Just 5 years ago, they had the same thing happen, but they lucked out. They were able to contain it. This year, they weren't so lucky. And then when they went to fight it, they weren't even close to being repaired. I mean, how can you not have water in a fire hydrant? I mean, the whole thing is just unbelievable. And it does make you want to ask that question that you asked.
Thank you.
Opening the floor up again. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll get you selected.
I'll just state that time after time with these issues like fire, what we're being told here in the media completely severed from reality and completely severed from what the science, the facts, and the data tell us. The best global satellite data is the Copernicus satellite now. We're able to see globally fires and capture, and that tells us very clearly that fires globally have been in decline for decades. You don't hear that. They have to silence that information and only spread the fear, the climate fear, instead of the true science of what's going on.
No, the wildfires are down globally 25% over the past 20 years, 2 decades. I've never seen that as in a headline once, or even inserted into a story saying, despite this fire, in fact, you never see that. I constantly see in California, they've never had fires as large as this. Historically, they had 100-year droughts in California, and wildfires, for hundreds of years, they had burned an average of 2 to 4 million acres a year. So we have largely suppressed wildfires on forest. We've logged, we had roads in, but after President Reagan, they changed forest management, went from treating it as, remember the Department of Forest, the U.S. Forest Service is in the Department of Agriculture because trees were considered timber for public use, they changed to ecosystem management, what they called ecosystem management, which meant either no management or mismanagement. And they not only cut back on logging and brush clearing, but they ripped out the roads that gave access to the forest to fight fires before they reached urban areas. So it's a series of missteps in the US, but globally wildfires are down, but that doesn't mean that other countries aren't managing their forest and urban rural interfaces as bad as we are here. And then, gosh, I don't know what accounts for the huge uptick in arsonists. Maybe just the media attention they get, social media, I don't know.
Opening the floor up to questions again. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
I have to say too, rather than spreading fear, if we can look at the science, the facts, and the data, and we see by almost every metric, though, Earth's ecosystems are thriving and prospering and humanity's benefiting. It's a completely different story than this spread of a climate fear. The climate facts tell us that we should celebrate additional warmth and more CO2. That's what the facts tell us.
Again, the floor is open for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Yeah, I see there's a question in the chat about what is the cost to do underground cabling. I remember when I first started working in this area in the 90s, people were freaking out about electromagnetic fields, EMF, and everyone was freaked out because the utility industry might have to spend $12 billion burying underground cables. Well, if we're not going to manage forests and brushland and make sure that fires don't get started, it certainly seems that, burying cables is, considering that electricity outages are a problem in hurricanes as well. It seems that, burying cables can certainly be considered as a reasonable practice if we're not going to, force utilities to actually manage their power lines and not be negligent and make sure that the land underneath power lines is maintained so that a spark doesn't start a conflagration.
It certainly would be a fraction of the cost of the damage to do that, right? Not to mention the salvation of human lives, right?
Yeah, and of course there's, we just allocated $369 billion last year for wind, solar, EVs, all of which, if implemented exactly as planned, will have exactly zero impact on weather and the climate. If we're going to spend public money, we ought to spend it to make sure to enhance public safety. That's why we pay taxes, to be made safe, and the government is just not doing that.
And by the way, all that wind and solar will need new transmission, none of which is being buried. So right. they're putting more transmission lines in the path of in the Midwest, since they're building most of the wind in the Midwest and the West and wanting to ship it east or west. Right. They're putting them in the path of natural disasters like tornadoes every year.
Right.
Good point.
That's one more evidence of bad planning, of just not thinking about what you're doing.
Could you guys speak more to President Biden's response, as well as GOP candidates will debate tonight, kind of their plan and future of how they would handle a situation, what you would like to hear from them on this issue?
Yeah, so I'll take that. So, of course, everyone saw the clip of President Biden in Lahaina comparing his, small house fire that threatened his Corvette and his cat to the just absolute devastating tragedy in Lahaina, and that speaks for itself. It'll be interesting tonight to see if any Republican candidates bring that up, and as well as the whole Democrat response to this. I mean, Hawaii is a Democrat state. It has been managed so far as a disaster. I think what happened there is inexcusable. I think this, we are increasingly seeing government failure across the board. Government's job is to keep us safe. It's not doing it at the border. It's not doing it with wildfires. Instead, we're, pointlessly spending hundreds of billions of dollars on things that are going to make no difference, and wind up distracting not only government, but distracting businesses. Utilities should be concerned with providing reliable, affordable, energy, and making sure that the power lines are safe. Not wondering what the temperature is going to be in 2100. Hawaii Electric, in its ESG report for 2022, fretted wildfires in the year 2100 from global warming. Well, we had wildfires this year because maybe Hawaii Electric, maybe a spark from one of their down power lines, just happened at the wrong time and the wind took it, and the rest is history. But so it'd be interesting to see tonight at the debate whether any Republicans talk about this, how the Biden administration, is just failing us, and they show no sign of understanding why they're failing us or even caring about whether they're failing.
The tying into the weaponization of the media. Look, at one time we had journalists who investigated meatpacking plants, and they investigated corruption in government, and they investigated, myriad things. Now we have media that suppresses truthful stories about laptops until 2 years after it's too late. They seem to be bought and paid for partisans for the fringe, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party at this stage. They could do investigative journalism. They could have done where did the $100 million from the governor go, and how much of it was spent to prevent wildfires today, not 100 years from now? They could do that story still. I doubt that they will. They could have done investigative stories about the degradation of the reclaimed lands through invasive grasses. They didn't, as far as I can tell. When they report on hurricanes, they could report, guess what? Hurricanes are neither more frequent nor more severe now than they have been 100 years from now. So maybe we need to focus on hardening places that face hurricanes every year regardless, or at least threatened by them. Those aren't the stories they're writing. And maybe if someone on the debate tonight wanted to bring that up, that'd be a nice thing. Might be a nice thing. Why isn't journalism doing its job of speaking truth to power any longer?
Again, opening the floor up to any more questions. This will be the last call of questions, and then we'll go ahead and conclude today's call. It looks like Iris, you have a question. Just please state your name and outlet and ask away.
Hi, this is Iris Tao with NTD Television, and you talked about the need for a fair investigation into the Maui wildfires. And my question would be, what should we do to prevent such incidents from happening in the future? Is there anything specific that you think the government should be doing more or stop doing? And how can we as Americans get more involved?
We've already really addressed that. Part of that, there are two simple things we could do. You could bury the power lines, because it sure looks like that was the cause of the ignition events this year. The other is to create fire breaks around towns in your home. And if we do those two things, we could certainly getting rid of invasive grasses is nearly impossible. It would take massive chemical eradication to do that, and no one's going to agree to that. It's going to be very difficult, but we can manage the grasses. And like I said before, if you've got a home that's isolated, I know in my home city of Pittsburgh, they have herds of goats on the hillsides there that actually eat the grasses to keep them down. That's just one inexpensive solution of how we might be able to fight this. But one way or the other, we need to have these fire breaks and also better protect our electricity system from high winds that might down the power lines.
I don't know that I disagree with Greg there, but I do disagree. I don't think it's too expensive to deal with the native grasses. You plow them, you replant native fire resistant grasses and plants, and then you maintain it. You do what they did before the grasses came in. You know, they were farming then when they were plowing every year. Okay, get in there and pull them up, rake them up by the roots, plow it, and then replant, and then maintain what you've replanted. Is it expensive? Even if they did it with chemical treatment, there's no question about it. Is it more expensive than having an entire community wiped out by a wildfire? Not at all. And I think that if you were replanting with native grasses and native plants, especially those that are fire resistant, then they have those, the community would be thankful. They'd welcome a more natural Hawaii.
Yeah. So, and Iris, I'm just going to close this one out by saying I think we need accountability in government. I think heads should roll for this. I mean, this is not just negligence. This is reckless negligence. I think it borders on criminality. If people are not held responsible, no one will take their job seriously. If you want the job, you've got to do it. The Hawaii governor, Josh Green wanted to be governor of Hawaii, but he hasn't done the job. The guy who was in charge of emergency management on Maui, at least he resigned. The guy who held up the water for 5 hours from the fire department, he's been reassigned. But I think we need an investigation, an honest one. And then we need to have accountability. And I think government officials around the country at every level, federal and state, need to have the fear of God put in them, that they need to do their jobs and do them well. We just don't have that anymore. We have a bunch of people who are making a boatload of money, get great pensions, and then do a lousy job. And in Hawaii, a tragically lousy job.
Thank you for the questions. Is there any more? Otherwise, we will wrap up today's discussion. Last call for any additional questions. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today and being part of our conversation. If you have any additional questions that you may think of later, feel free to reach out to me or my colleague Mark, and we're happy to get you in contact with any of these experts.